and thank you for joining today's Research Nexus kickoff. We have Dr. Meaghan Ruddy from the Rights Center present to us about different types of qualitative research. I think it's a great way to start today's this semester's Research Nexus program. Dr. Ruddy has loads of experience in qualitative research. She has a huge background in, I'm sorry for using inappropriate grammar right now because I'm like a little flummoxed with being a little late and joining. But so thank you. Thank you for your patience. But Dr. Ruddy has a body of research behind her in medical education, and we hope to learn a lot from her today. She is no stranger to us. She's one of us, in fact. So I will, without much ado, I will let Dr. Ruddy take over and start her presentation. If you need access to her slides, she has very kindly let us have access to them. I will email them to you if you let me know. Thank you. And Dr. Ruddy, please take over.
Thank you, Dr. Roy. Thank you, everyone, for allowing me to join you today. Just for the purposes of making sure that the audio and video doesn't skip around, I'm going to turn off my video. But hello, happy Thursday, I guess. I don't actually ever know what day it is anymore. But again, thank you so much for letting me join you today. And we'll see if PowerPoint lets me go into slideshow mode here. If not, I'll do, there we go. Okay, so I was asked to do this a while ago, and then, I don't know if you know, but there's been a pandemic. So it kind of got waylaid by that. And I think at the time there had been some requests for more information, specifically around potentially focus groups. And so the end of this discussion is going to spend a lot of time on that. And I really hope that I didn't prepare a ton of work for presentation because I was really hoping that we would be able to have more of a discussion, but just to sort of set the stage in terms of just kind of the basics of qualitative research. That's sort of why this is a brief on the types and methods of qualitative research. And for anybody who may know this already, it's sort of old hat for you. You're sort of checking in to see if I know what I'm talking about. I appreciate you being here, and please feel free to jump in at any time. Because I'm full screen sharing, my Zoom toolbar is hidden. So if you put something in the chat, I might not see it right away, but I will try to be attentive to the chat. And then, of course, we'll have plenty of time at the end of the hour for discussion. So I have no financial relationship to disclose regarding this content. And as you can see, by the way, being a qualitative searcher, that's one of the values of it, is that almost nobody is going to try to buy my talents and attention for this, which it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek, but it's actually a comment on the unseen value of it, and something that I hope will begin to change as the country's approach to understanding perspectives changes. So just a quick apology. I noticed as I was going through this that I was flipping back and forth between APA formatting and AMA formatting, and so I apologize. So those of you who are sticklers for that, please forgive me, but I just didn't have the time to spend a lot of time on those details. So again, I apologize. I know it's not clean, but we're friends here, so hopefully you can give me a little bit of permission. So our objectives today are to really just give you a very brief overview. Each one of the slides that I'm about to show you could be its own module. And so again, if this is interesting to you, if people want to talk more about it, I'm more than happy to do it. I love qualitative research. I don't get to talk about it enough. So I'm happy to talk your ear off, but that's not my objective today. My objective is that you should be able to walk away from our time together being able to describe the value of qualitative research, to describe the types and techniques of qual, to describe the basic how-tos of focus groups. And again, if that's the thing that people are really wanting to know, we can spend a lot of time there if you like. And then I found a really wonderful article that explains sort of the when to use and how to judge qualitative research specifically in medicine and medical education. So on the slides that I gave to Dr. Roy to share, everything has the links, and all of the articles are relatively recent, I think within the last 5 to 10 years. So it was really great to see all of the stuff out there actually these days. So what's so great about qualitative research? Why should we care? So the answer to this question will differ a little bit person to person who's involved. This is simply how I frame my frame of reference for qualitative research, is that it marries meaning to measure. I think a lot of times, as a PhD, a lot of times in PhD programs, people spend a lot of time on the stats, they spend a lot of time on the numbers, and in my humble opinion, this has led to problematic research and p-hacking and all kinds of stuff, because we're paying so much attention to the number and not enough attention to what does it really mean. Qualitative research also embraces the complex, which is not normal for research, and so therefore is viewed askance a lot of the time. And I think the thing that people who do that to qualitative research don't get is this third point, which is humility of outcome. Qualitative research is only really describing, and I have another picture to show you to kind of drive this point home, it is thoroughly describing one small thing. It is not claiming to be overly general. If you find qualitative research that is claiming to be overly general, that's problematic. But it's really just about the depth of knowing. So in my estimation, it's an opportunity to come into an intimate knowing with our subject, and then with how we relate to that subject. And so the quote I have up here from C.S. Peirce is something called the pragmatic maxim. And it goes, consider what effects, which might conceivably have practical bearings, we conceive the object of our conception to have. Then the whole of our conception of those effects is the whole of our conception of the object. Basically, it is an argument for saying that as we come into more intimate knowing with a thing, not only will our knowledge about the thing change, but so do we change along with it. And to me, all of the recent research, and actually the National Academy just released a great document about the exposome, which is, all of the things to which we are exposed from, cradle to grave, and how that impacts our epigenetics and our health outcomes. And the exposome is an excellent, mostly quantitative measure of what it means to live in a given exposure zone. And so it's just another way of coming into a more complex and intimate knowing. So this is one of the things that I took this away actually from my own PhD training. This was like a sidebar that one of the professors mentioned, and it really stuck with me. So Barbara McClintock won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1983 for her discovery of transposons in maize. And when asked how she came to know it, like what kind of really clicked, how did she figure this out? This was her quote, that no two plants are exactly alike. They're all different. And as a consequence, you have to know that difference. I start with the seedling and I don't want to leave it. I don't feel I really know the story if I don't watch the plant all the way along. So I know every plant in the field. I know them intimately, and I find it a great pleasure to know them. Now, she didn't necessarily publish all of that qualitative research, but that qualitative time that she spent, that qualitative work that she did, helped her to find transposons. So even if it's not necessarily something that some of you would want to publish on, and you don't necessarily want to come up with code books and inter-rater reliability and all that stuff we'll talk about in a minute, it's the nature of getting to know something at that depth that can help you to break through a problem that you might be stuck with in terms of a calculation or a phenomenon. And so I have a little bit of and excuse me, I'm a little under the weather, so I'm going to take a quick drink. So again, we all have different approaches. Our background beliefs absolutely and without question become filters through which we understand reality. And so one of mine, my background, some of you who know me well know that I have a degree in philosophy and a degree in theology. So I tend to come at things already from a pretty maybe overwrought sense of depth when it comes to trying to understand something. And this is an approach to knowing, kind of an epistemological standpoint that was created by, or not necessarily created, but was written about by a guy named Tom Kasulis in a book called Intimacy or Integrity. And we all have those books that we've read 100 times and that are kind of like our go-to tomes on our shelves. And this is one for me. But I think that this gets to the difference between qualitative and quantitative research. So typical quantitative research that we're all familiar with, that I think the public is more familiar with when it comes to stats and percentages. And believe me, I know what I just said. I know that they're not really familiar with it like Gen Pop, but when we talk about research, people think about stats. And that is a totally legitimate, extremely important, extremely informative, educational way of going about understanding reality, right? And it asserts that there are two independent atomistic things, like these circles on the right with the bar between them, that these independent atomistic things might have a relationship between them, dependent, independent variable, you can think about it, and that the relationship between them doesn't, or our relationship, you can think of the R as the researcher as well, doesn't really change the nature, our knowing of the relationship doesn't change the nature of the things, right? That they are still integral, they still have a sense of their own integrity, whether or not they are in relationship to another thing. When it comes to sort of human relationships, you might think of this as sort of the get past and move on mentality when something happens, right? Whereas intimacy, I look at qualitative research getting into this more intimate nature where the relationship is really where these two seemingly separate integral pieces overlap, because there really is no true separation between two things depending on your approach to it, right? At the molecular level, when I used to teach philosophy, I would, talk about at the sort of the quantum level, where does your finger stop and where does the table start? At the quantum level, like how would we even know that? There is some sort of fundamental ontological overlap, and qualitative research just sort of focuses on the overlap, and really trying to explore that. And so from a human relationship perspective, this might be more of a grow through sort of when something happens. And the way that Kasulis talks about this is, if you were to look at these as human relationships, when a relationship ends between two wholes, the wholes are largely unchanged in an integrity perspective. But if from an intimacy perspective, if there is a change in the relationship, both wholes, the structure of both wholes is forever changed, right? And so it's just a matter of perspective. Neither one nor the other is necessarily better or worse. It's just helpful to know from which perspective you are coming when you examine a phenomenon. So types of qualitative research. So John Cresswell, and I believe it's his son, J. David Cresswell, are the gurus on qualitative research generically. And yes, that is his website. And it's kind of like, where are you putting the website up there? But honestly, it's the Bible for those of us who do this. The older books, I couldn't find mine when I was trying to do this. I think I lent it to somebody. But that's the book to look at for the kind of generic information and really good descriptions of each one of these types of approaches. So the types of approaches are sometimes called methods. Again, because of my background, language really, really matters to me. And to me, for this conversation between us today, method is going to be the activity of gathering data and the analysis. So the qualitative research we're going to talk about right now are the types. There are 5 main types. We'll talk about each of them independently. So narrative is relatively new, the newer development in the field, and its use is sometimes disputed because all of qualitative research is really about story. Narrative researchers will tell you that their research should be considered a separate genre because they are focusing on the story itself and not necessarily what the story is saying, or how. It's more about how the story is saying it rather than what the story is saying. It's a little bit of a nuanced point. This article that links at the bottom is a really good and in-depth explanation written from the perspective of someone who does it. It's not my cup of tea, so I don't want to potentially dissuade anybody from getting really interested in it. But it would be, all of these stories on this shelf, looking at the stories themselves rather than at the subjects of the stories. Right. So it's a little bit meta in that sense, but very, very interesting. Just not something I've myself focused on. Ethnography. Ethnography is big in medicine. It is an incredibly important way to understand particularly how a given culture might experience a health condition, might experience a social determinant, might experience utilization of a particular medical intervention. Just ethnography is just so absolutely valuable, and probably hands down the most oft cited and best and most thorough example of this is The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down. I don't know if anybody's familiar with this book. It is fantastic. I mean, really just something. And essentially it is an ethnography of epilepsy among immigrant population, and just fascinating stuff. Just an excellent, I can't speak enough of it. If you don't necessarily have the time to read the book, because I won't lie, the print is small and the pages are many. it's a time sucker. This article from the New York Times, it's free. I was able to access it, which is why I put it here. It's basically the life and death of the subject of the book, and it does summarize the work very, very well. The link from TNF Online underneath the quote leads you to an article about ethnography specifically, and it's an excellent article on how to do it. But essentially, it's a really in-depth, intimate knowing of how a particular frame of reference, which is often cultural but not always, is used to interpret a phenomenon. So ethnography will use observations, interviews, and documentary data, or whatever kind of extant information to produce a detailed and comprehensive account of different social phenomena. So it's typically based on a culture's engagement with a particular thing. Really, really love this book. So Barbara Maxwell said in the chat that she has had students read and discuss this book within their cultural competence course. Right. So you were doing also an introduction to ethnography, kind of as a part of the implicit curriculum, which is wonderful. Yeah, it's excellent. So we'll move on, if I can get the thing to click. Okay. So phenomenological qualitative research is probably my favorite and probably the hardest to do. It is definitely my favorite because it is entirely grounded in philosophy, given my background. That's why I mentioned it earlier. And it's really hard to do because it's actually very, very challenging to describe a phenomenon in itself and not the contributing factors to the phenomenon. Like it's very, very challenging, but it's wonderful. The article that I've linked there has excellent examples, excellent explanation, but basically it is the study of an individual's lived experiences. So you might have a phenomenology of someone who has been incarcerated, right? Like what is the phenomenon of being incarcerated from that particular person's perspective. The book that I have a picture of here, Clark Moustakis, is kind of like the Cresswell of this particular kind of qualitative research. It's I don't know actually if it's necessarily still in print, but it's still available and around, and it has excellent examples. Like the last chapter at least or two of the book is nothing but examples of how to do this. It's really, really wonderful. It's not qualitative research for beginners by any stretch, so I wouldn't initially jump into this. But if you've read The Clinic by Foucault, that is essentially a phenomenological research project, although it's much more philosophical in nature than an actual research project would be. So again, it's sort of like narrative in that it's kind of hard to do and it's related to all the other ones. But if you really get into it, boy, does it kind of pull your interest, like, man, I want to do a really good phenomenological study one day. So the last two are going to be the ones that come up most often, I think, in medical education and in medicine as a practice. And that's grounded theory. Grounded theory is actually used a ton in nursing, like just a ton. It's kind of interesting to me that that's kind of what they gravitated toward. But essentially, it is to discover or construct a theory from data systematically obtained and analyzed using comparative analysis. So if you know that there's a thing going on and you're not entirely sure what it is, you can get all of your stuff together and code for themes, and then suddenly you'll come up with oh, I have this theory about how this thing is happening or about why this thing is working. And my theory is grounded in this data. So that's why they call it grounded theory. And Glasser or Glaser, I know people who say it both ways, and Strauss are to grounded theory what Cresswell is to qualitative generally. And actually, the title of my talk today is a little tongue-in-cheek because I happen to agree with, I believe it was Strauss, who wanted to take the perspective that everything is data. It's positive, neutral, or negative, but you can't discount it. And that actually, I believe, is what kind of broke up their band, so to speak, because whoever was the proponent of that thought, I'm pretty sure it was Strauss, Glasser did not agree with that statement, because it can be problematically confounding to think of data that way. But I really do, again, I think it's all based on kind of where you're coming at the information from. So at the top of this slide, you will see an excellent article on grounded theory research. It's a great kind of a how-to on how to do it for people who've never done it before. Really, really, really good, helpful article. And then the article at the bottom is an example of a good grounded theory paper. So that's why I gave you both of these in case this is something that you want to look more into. Case study. Now, this is probably the one with which people are most familiar. It's really very popular in business education to kind of look at a business as a case and kind of take it apart. So you can think of the collapse of a company like Enron or Lehman Brothers. I think it would not be at all surprising to me to find that relatively soon there will be multiple case studies on Moderna as a company. I've seen a lot of good case studies in education about charter schools. So it's very, very popular. The link is actually a link to the LibGuide at UCSF, but their section on case study is awesome, and it has all kinds of free links out about how to do it. And I have the picture of the computer case here because to me, it's a really good symbolic example of what a case study should do. So you have a case, which would be the entirety of this computer tower, but it is comprised of fans and lights and the actual structure of the case and all the different shelves on the inside and the hard drives and the wires and the optics and the video card and the memory and the motherboard and the CPU. A really good case study will take apart all of the pieces, analyze them, figure out how they all work together, and then put it all back together at the end to say, and this is the thing. Right. So a really good qualitative case study is a very, very, very helpful tool. Hard to do because once you start to get into those weeds, you start to find knots you need to untangle, but a very rewarding and a very fascinating. If you're interested enough in the case, it's a fascinating way to go about understanding how a phenomenon like a company or an innovation or a disruption or a curriculum, like you could really figure a case could be just about anything, an individual, a group, or event, right? Really could be anything. And just sort of it's the approach of taking all the pieces apart, understanding how they all work together, and then putting them all back together in a way that makes sense. So the techniques of gathering data, or what I would consider the methods, are there's really three: interviews, observations, and materials review. Like those are the big three. But then as you can see, interviews gets complex, right? There's a lot of different ways to do interviews. So in terms of interviewer interface, you can do one-to-ones, you can do focus groups, you can do subgroup discussions. You can do something that Cavalli and Brinkman, which is the book that I reference here, called computer assisted. So like, are you doing it through emails, type chats? Those things are all considered interviews. The interview types, you have factual, which is you're just going over the facts of the case, sort of like what detectives do when they're trying to solve a crime. You have a narrative interview, which is you're trying to get someone to tell you the story of the thing that you're interested in, or their experience of the thing, if you're trying to do either ethnographic or phenomenology. Then you have a discursive interview, which is more like a conversation that you might have, where you, as an interviewer, you have your tool, you have your questions, but you have structured your research such that if the interviewee wants to take it in an unexpected direction, you are open to that in terms of your research method, because you are following where they lead, which is a valued way of doing it. There's semi-structured, which is where you have parts of interviews that are sort of kind of open-ended. It's a little bit like discursive, except it's discursive intends to go off in different directions, whereas semi-structured really doesn't, but it kind of allows you some flexibility. And then you have in-depth, where you sort of really go into mining the depths, getting to the ore of an issue. Kind of, it's almost like instead of the 5 whys, if people are familiar with that framework, it would be like the 455 whys, like just keep digging. Observations, this is where sometimes people who have an issue with qualitative research will talk about like going native or getting in the way, because you become the tool. You know, in qualitative research, the researcher is the tool. It's not a survey. It's not a like a Likert scale thing. It's you, because you're observing. So making those observations is important, and that's why it's really important to kind of understand your background beliefs. Like, how are you observing? How aware are you as a researcher of how much you are bringing in to the observation? And then materials review. See a lot of meta-analysis use materials review. It's a very valuable thing to do, but to make it, for qualitative research, it's really only a part of the whole, because there's someone who made that material and there's a reason they made it, right? So it's not just looking at the material itself. I need another drink, excuse me. So I included this because Dr. Roy informed me about that interest in focus groups. Again, I think some of those conversations were a little bit maybe literally last year, 2020, sometime early 2020. So hopefully this is still interesting to some of you. So just in the basics, again, very brief overview of focus groups. Typically 6 to 10, you can do more, you can do less, but if you do less, you might as well do one-to-ones, unless you're trying to really get at like, there's only 4 people who know about the thing, or there's 3 individuals whose perspective you really want to gather. So, I mean, that's why I say typically, it's any more than 10, and you really, it's kind of a pain to do the coding, which is what comes after, and the room can get kind of rowdy. So you kind of want to keep it manageable. So whatever you can manage. Focus groups are awesome because they encourage diverse viewpoints. Like, you have these different people in the room because you want to know what different demographic representatives might have to say about a thing. You have to be careful about that though, right? Because no one individual is the perfect spokesperson for their demographic, but it will give you kind of a taste of what someone in their position might think. It's great for exploratory studies if you kind of don't know where to start and you're like, like, what do we do about this intervention? Well, let's see how people feel about it. Okay, focus group. Like, it's a great way to start. There is a lot of reduction of moderator control, especially, as I said, the bigger the group gets. You know, you might have your semi-structured interview sheet in front of you, and you know the questions you want to ask, but you've only got, 90 minutes, and boy, they really want to take the conversation someplace else, and what are you going to do? And then, like I said, the transcripts get really messy. People talk over each other. You miss important points. Like, it can get frustrating. So general considerations about this, though, for all the good that focus groups do, you really got to be careful about power dynamics, especially in medical education. If people are trying to impress or are worried about their grade, or are concerned about the psychological safety in the room, you're not going to get the truth. You'll get what they think you want to hear. So really making sure that focus groups are conducted by someone with zero skin in the game is really important. It's the conversation can kind of go three different ways, more or less. You can sort of have a philosophical discussion, which is kind of where you want to go with it, especially if you're talking about something exploratory, ethnographic, kind of want to get their sense of a thing. And then there's the interviews, which is again hard to do with focus groups. But I think when you see focus groups done for like a documentary or on a television show, and it's the camera shows the interviewer, the camera shows the group, the camera focuses in on the individual answering the question, the camera goes back to the interviewer, right? So you can do it that way. There's also a therapeutic nature to the conversation, which can be good. It can be really, really good, especially when you've got a really well-moderated group of open people who are willing to be open about a hard subject, like racism, for example, or racism in medicine. Get a mixed race group and start really talking about it. A lot of good can come out of that. However, it can also end very, very badly. So like really, really making sure that the moderator really understands power dynamics and how to facilitate a discussion. Maybe somebody with a background in conflict training is probably the best kind of person to do that with the tougher subjects. Then as an interviewer, you have to know, and also as a researcher putting together a concept for a focus group, like what are you kind of like digging for particular, are you looking for a particular ore, a particular metal down at the bottom of a well, or are you just kind of interested in sort of going from person to person, like different stops on the road, and just kind of getting a sense, that epistemological stance will help you to understand how to create your interview schema so that you can get to the data you want, and you can limit the amount of data that might not be helpful from infiltrating the conversation. And then, of course, there are ethical considerations, as with all other participant-based research, informed consent and all that good stuff. But I think even more so, it's about really understanding very intimately the thing you want to know more about so that you know how to ask it without violating anyone's sense of morality, because it is very easy to inflict moral injury with what to one person is a very innocent question, but to another one is actually extremely triggering and problematic. So really being careful with how you ask questions, especially in a mixed group, gender, race, OMS year, right? Whenever you have a mixed group, just kind of really being careful about who you're asking, how you're asking, and why you're asking. So techniques for analyzing data. Of course, this depends on the research question. Excuse me. But for the most part, I say it depends on the research question because the research question will guide you toward which thing carries more weight. But for the most part, you'll look at your interview transcripts and you'll analyze those. You'll look at your observation notes and you'll analyze those. You'll look at your materials and you'll analyze those, and you will code them. And it's the coding that's the key to qualitative research, which is why you really need to kind of know as much as there is to know about your thing before you even begin to put together an interview survey. So you could code it for frequency of mention if you're just kind of doing that sort of traveler approach, just kind of going around the room and sort of say how often does this thing come up for this group, right? Or you can look for, what does this thing actually mean to this group, which would be more of that minor perspective. And really when it comes to inter-rater reliability, the more people you have looking at the transcripts, the less work for any individual. And back when I was doing this, like in vivo and stuff, it wasn't super reliable. It's definitely getting better, but the best AI has yet to improve upon human understanding of things like idioms. And so you might look for actual frequency of mention of a term, but you really need to know your data in case someone is mentioning it without using the exact terminology. And that's, again, where inter-rater reliability can be helpful because, you can read something and say, like in education, the word curriculum gets thrown around and it means a thing, and people will use it to talk about a rotation, a specific course, and not necessarily the entirety of a curriculum. And so, looking for things like that, that you as a researcher, by knowing your subject intimately, will pick up on, that a software may not. Okay, so when do you use it? Oh, I would say as often as possible, but again, that's just me. And this is the article, the qualitative research methods, when to use it and how to use them, from Human Reproduction. This is such a good article. They actually wrote it in response to an article that they saw use qualitative methodologies poorly. And they got so riled up that they wrote this amazing paper on it, just really fantastic. So I definitely recommend it. But essentially, the short answer is you use qualitative research when you want to answer questions about experience, meaning, and perspective from the standpoint of the participant. So what do you want to know? What your students are experiencing, what it means to them, their perspective on it? Qualitative research. You want to know those things about a patient's experience of a thing? Qualitative research. A colleague's experience? Qualitative research, right? So that's really, and it's often the starting point for excellent quantitative research down the road. So I think of it, I was looking for a picture, just kind of scanning the common license pictures online, thinking, what's like a good visual metaphor for this? And to me, I was actually looking for a half colored in picture. And so it's awesome that the one I found happened to be a mandala. But essentially, to me, and again, I know that I am coming at this with my own particular hammer, but to me, quantitative research is the black and white side, and qualitative research adds the color. So when your numbers need context, when bench science contacts actual medical care, or when we're not sure to go next, these are all good places to say, well, I don't know, what do people think about this? And engage in a qualitative study. So how to judge it? I found myself often in the position of having to defend my choice to do qualitative research, because we don't have logical regression and p-values and all that stuff, which is important, but we just don't have it. Like, you don't have it, you don't have it. You can't pretend like you do. So people would say, well, how do I know, like, how does this mean anything? Well, it means anything because of trustworthiness, credibility, applicability, and consistency. So essentially, when you're doing qualitative research, you have to be absolutely 100% transparent with your methods and the cogency of your approach. So if you're going to really do it, your IRB protocol has to be just absolutely above reproach. You have to call out all of the things. It's really very hard to do, but it's worth the time, because you want people to know that, I know that I am coming at any given thing from the perspective of a cisgendered white female of middle age with an American background, like really calling it out, just to say that there is only so much objectivity that exists, period. And I am not claiming to any special corner market on objectivity and what I'm trying to do. Credibility is in those analysis methods, in the gathering of data and in the analysis. So reflexivity, looking back and forth between your code book. You can't code the data and then put the data aside and only look at your code book. You're constantly going back and forth and double checking and triple checking and quadruple checking. And does it really mean this? And if there's something vague, throwing it off your other researchers, or kind of bringing it to a larger discussion group and saying, hey, I'm seeing this. What do you guys think? And like really, really making sure that you're going back and forth. Triangulation, same way, looking at your data, looking at your code book, looking at your literature, making sure I'm still on point, and the substantial description. So those of you who are familiar with that When the Spirit Catches You book, it is so intensely descriptive. And that's what makes it such a great ethnography. Some people read it and they get frustrated and they're like, what do I need to know this for? And then I'm like, you're not a qualitative researcher. You need to know that because that's important to the entirety of the picture. And then applicability. So, if you're doing something in medical education, making sure that it's not just it's not just applicable to one particular course at one particular school, but could these findings fit into contexts outside, right? So this is what in quantitative research you would call generalizability. Qualitative research doesn't want to claim to be generalizable, but it might be applicable to other situations. And then consistency, and that's why it's helpful to do qualitative research in a team or in a group, because then it's not just one person's perspective, it's 2, 3, 4, 5 people's perspective on this is what we as a group think this means. Okay, so that's it in terms of the slides that I have created today. I am very happy to answer questions. We can keep the slides up and sort of go back and talk about a particular point. I'm happy to field any questions. I can't profess that I'll definitely have the answer, but I will give it my best shot.
So at this point, thank you, Dr. Ruddy. That was amazing. And thank you for, really appreciate you taking the time out from your busy, busy schedule to talk to us today.
My pleasure.
At this point in time, does anybody in the audience have any questions? Oh, Dr. Morgan has a question for you, Dr. Ruddy. Can you discuss how one might avoid bias in qualitative research?
I think so my first answer is we are, as human beings, unable to avoid bias anywhere. So I would not expect that we would able to avoid it in qualitative research. I think the thing that's important to do is to get really, really intimate with your own understanding of where you are coming from and your interpretation of a thing, so that you understand what biases you are bringing and calling them out in your discussion. And to sort of, if you have a broken leg and you walk with a crutch, acknowledge the crutch. I think that's really very important. Yeah, I believe, I agree with you, Kelly. I don't think that it is possible to avoid it, but I think that you can shine a light on it. And when you do that, it will cause you to sort of, I'm going to default to something, and I apologize if this doesn't make sense to anybody, but so Robert Keegan has a theory of constructive developmentalism that he calls the subject-object principle, for lack of a better word. And so the idea is that we are subject to a lot of things at any particular developmental level, right? We are subject to, when we are reacting to a situation, it is because we are subject to our habitual reactions to similar situations. And as we develop and we grow, we are able to take those things to which we are subject and hold them out in front of us as objects and really examine them. And then we're no longer so subject to their effects. To me, that is the metaphor for how to address bias in any research, is to call it out and to say, I may be coming at it from this perspective, but I am aware of it, and here it is. So you, reader, are aware of it too.
Dr. Ruddy, this is Kelly again. And I think I know where Dr. Morgan's coming from this, because it's so hard. I published a paper, well, not published, submitted a paper recently that was pretty qualitative. And, when we started recognizing even a lot of our biases after the fact that maybe we didn't recognize up front when we were conducting the study.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, you want to try and minimize any bias up front if you can figure out how to do that. But so now we're reporting all this in the paper, and I'm like paranoid, like this is going to get rejected because of all these things I'm now calling out. So is there a way to do that doesn't feel so scary or worrisome?
So I think, well, first of all, so any really good qualitative journal will appreciate that and expect it. I think it comes with practice, right? As with anything. So the more you do it, the more you begin to catch yourself from the jump to say, okay, am I doing it again? Like if I'm looking at a thing and, for example, let's say I work better with examples. So let's say it's, So this isn't a research example, but it's kind of a good, it's a potentially instructive. So, and I think I've talked about it with an overlapping group in another context. So back when I started, I used to teach in an allopathic medical school for a short time, and I was teaching there before I was in my doctoral program, but I had not yet earned my PhD, and I was teaching ethics because I had taught it for forever in undergraduate liberal arts colleges, and my reviews, my student faculty reviews, oh, they were vicious. They were so vicious. They were attacking my clothes and they were attacking my lack of credentials and just absolutely, absolutely vicious. And I was having a hard time figuring out how to understand that. And my immediate bias was to say, oh, well, these are like medical types and they just don't understand ethics and they don't understand the humanities and they're already coming at it with a problem or whatever. But then later on, I realized, oh, part of this was because they, as a student cohort, had a huge fallout with the school leadership about dress codes that I was unwittingly violating and that no one had told me. So they were reacting to something that they had experienced, and I was reacting to something that I thought that they had experienced was actually something else. So we do this all the time, right? Like we discover our own cognitive biases and heuristics and the junk we bring into any conversation. We do it all the time. So the trick with research is just to kind of discover your junk ahead of time. So if you're looking at a particular thing, one of the first questions you should ask yourself is, why am I looking at this? What do I find so particularly fascinating about this thing? That little trick kind of helps me to kind of begin to dig up the dirt, but I think it's just practice. I see some other comments in the chat.
That's a great question. Thank you.
Oh yeah, you're welcome. I hope it was helpful. Qualitative journals. So the challenge with journals that are more accepting of qualitative work is that they are hard. You're right, they're hard to find. I want to default to the Journal of Transformative Education, but I happen to be a consulting editor on that, so that seems a little self-serving, but so that's a good one. I guess if folks are interested, I could do a deeper dive and come up with a couple of journals. I actually have a list somewhere, Chris, but I haven't looked at it for forever. And then my dissertation, so this is Lori, my dissertation mentor encouraged me to write a reflection about what I already knew about the subject and my thoughts about going forward. That was, yeah, exactly, right? So kind of like looking at yourself up front before you even get into a literature search. It's sort of that like, what do I think I already know about this thing? And then kind of then looking at the literature to see if maybe it jives with you or if it's in conflict with what you already think. And I would then encourage you to pay more attention to that information that is in conflict with what you think, because it is at that point where you will kind of decide if you need to change your perspective. But that's a great practice too.
So, Dr. Ruddy, Dr. Degenhardt has a question. Will focus groups qualitative methods be a reasonable format for evaluating or facilitating the Delphi method for establishing expert opinions?
Well, I mean, my like knee-jerk reaction is to say, isn't that what Delphi is? Right? Isn't it just kind of a modified focus group? I mean, I guess it depends on kind of how you want to use it, how you want to approach it. While you are not, so when I did it, so when I only did it once. I actually did it with Robert Englander came to the school that I was working at to do a version of this around the EPAs. So we weren't asked questions, but we were asked to group things. But by asking people to group things, you are in a sense asking them questions. But you don't want to play too fast and loose with the rules of any one thing, because then you begin to blur the line and you lose that trustworthiness of approach. But I mean, I'm not too familiar with Delphi. Like I said, I've only really done it once. So I mean, it's an interesting question worth looking into. I don't know if that's even close to an answer or helpful.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's definitely something that we can work with because I absolutely have no idea what Delphi means myself. I'm a quantitative, but thank you for your answer. I do have a question myself.
Yeah.
For grounded theory and participation, for example, what are the ethical considerations one might have to have before they delve into those methodologies? Some of my students are interested in, working with patients, and these are, well, let's say, very underserved.
So the ethical considerations for qualitative research are not really all that different from the ethical considerations of good medical practice when dealing with, or with any kind of research when dealing with a vulnerable population. I think when you're doing interviews, it's especially easy for students to kind of get caught up in the perspective of the person that they want to advocate for. So I think it's just there's a couple different, okay, I guess I want to say there's a couple different realms of ethics, right? So there's ethics in terms of how you engage with your participants, and then there's research ethics to make sure that your research is good, cogent, quality stuff, right? So to make sure that your research, your methods are clean, for lack of a better term, you would want to make sure that your engagement with the participants is entirely above board and moderated. And that's hard to do when you're getting conversational. So making sure that people really understand their roles in the conversation. I think another thing is in the construction of the survey instrument. So that the interview instrument, because often you will want to give the focus group, if possible, you definitely want to give the people the questions so that you're not asking something surprising or shocking or that they don't understand. And then after you do an interview, you want to get their permission to give their transcript back to them and say, this is what I heard you say, is this accurate? And in that way, they get a chance to explain themselves or add a qualifying statement, or maybe even change their mind about something. Because sometimes once you see it written down on paper, you're like, oh, yeah, that's what I said, but that's not really what I meant. So I'm really making sure that you go back to the interviewee and you check and validate what you think you heard them say with what they said and what they meant to say. It's part of that triangulating process. But yeah, so it can get kind of messy kind of fast. So I don't know which piece of that ethical consideration you are thinking about, sort of like good, clean research methods versus engaging with participants.
It was more about like leading questions. That's what, like, I was like looking at a questionnaire constructed by a student, and I think there was like a bias about, the participants or the interviewees' educational background. So how do I get that student to format a student his question in a way? I know this might be a very, very like a simpleton asking you a question about something that she doesn't have no idea about.
No, this is really important, and it's probably a really good example. So go continue.
So I just don't know how to get him to or her to write the question, because I myself do not understand how to get that person to answer that question in a way that would not undermine his or her understanding of her own medical condition.
So the question is about level of education?
Yeah, the level of education and how it kind of interferes with the interviewee's way of wording questions or approaching the participant.
So the project is about determining if there's a relationship between level of education and understanding of medical condition?
No, it's the project was about about patient education and understanding.
Okay.
But the questions are, they're leading,
Something like
bas-
don't you think that your level of education kind of impacts the way that you, maybe
yeah.
not that way, but yeah. Well, the way to do that is to ask those kinds of questions discreetly in the demographics section.
Oh, okay.
And then
That makes
you do the analysis later.
That makes sense. Thank you. That was a simple fix.
Yeah, good. That was easy. They're often not easy. I mean, languaging survey questions is challenging. It's just as challenging as patient education. So I always kind of default to like the universal plain language. There's a great website about plain language. It's sort of that it doesn't matter about education level or like English as a second language, and what you lose in accuracy, you gain in clarity, which is so important for surveys and for patient education. And it's amazing how if you even look at like really seasoned researchers' survey questions, or like pollsters, right? Pollsters are great for this. So you look at like Pew or Nielsen, and the way they word, like every time you read a poll, you should look at the question, because the way the question is worded could have had significant impact on how that poll was responded to. And it's fascinating to me how often I still am like, man, if you would ask that question a different way, you would have gotten a completely different answer. So it's just, it's a really important question, and I appreciate it.
Thank you.
They are, no, Chris, you're absolutely right. And that's why it's always important about who's asking them to, who paid for the poll, who's asking them, what do they want to know. Marketing research is the same way. Like when people want to know how you feel about their brand, we could go into net promoter scores. Like the whole thing is very leading. You're welcome. Thank you, Kelly. So Dr. Roy has the PowerPoint. Those links are awesome. I can't recommend those articles enough. I'm happy to come back and go more into depth about some things if that would be interesting to folks, or you can always reach out to me. I do have an ATSU email, meaghanruddy@atsu.edu. I often forget to check it. So if you really want to get in touch with me, ruddym@therightcenter.org is probably the better one. But I promise I will try to get back to folks with any responses I might have. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you to everyone saying thank you in the chat. Thank you, Dean Morgan. Thank you, Lori. Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate your time and the opportunity to talk with you about this.
Thank you, Dr. Ruddy. And I hope that you visit with us again. I know we don't have to extend an invitation to come and chat with us, but, you know, we'll probably profit a lot by just talking to you. Listening to you was amazing. Thank you.
Anytime. Oh, gosh, thanks. Thanks so much. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.